Thank you everyone for joining today. I know that this is a challenging time and that taking time out of your schedule for conversations can sometimes be difficult. So I appreciate you joining and thank you very much to the organizers for putting this together. So as you can see, we're going to be talking about the dangers of dismissing dystopias today. I am a futurist, for a lack of a better word. What I do is I combine foresight and systems to really explore complex problems. And sometimes that includes fun things like looking at science fiction and understanding science fiction as a complex prototype for the future. And some of that work includes, going deep into problems like COVID-19 and understanding how we can all sort of contribute in a way that improves the situations that we're in. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into the content. So normally I like to talk about the importance of dystopias and share a story or two about why it's so important and so critical to pay attention to these narratives. And so in the past I've talked about how Russia is using dystopias to prototype the future, or how everyday dystopias like The Handmaid's Tale that we think are far-fetched actually have a basis in reality. But I kind of don't have to do that anymore because we are collectively experiencing dystopia right now. So my stance is that COVID-19 is an unevenly distributed dystopia. It's much more worse for some people than it is for others. For some of us, I've heard people say that this is a little bit of a break from the world. And for others, they're going through, just the most horrifying circumstances that we can think of in terms of losing loved ones, not being sure of where their next paycheck and their next meal is going to come from. So there is a widespread, sort of reaction to this. And I think it's really important and very telling about how the future is not evenly distributed. The same way the present is not evenly distributed and the past wasn't evenly distributed as well. So essentially what dystopias describe as a systems level breakdown. So we're looking at a breakdown like an environmental collapse, a political collapse, a social collapse, a economic collapse. But really it's happening at the systems level because it affects a lot of different people in a lot of different ways. So a dystopia isn't something that just happens to one person. It's something that's within the world and is happening to a lot of people. And unlike utopias, dystopias are very real. So with utopias, which means like a hybrid of good place and no place, so utopias were intentionally intended to mean no place, dystopias are very much so real and we can see them around the world, whereas utopias, we can't really point to a place on a map and say, yeah, here's where everything is perfect and everything is good and everything is sustainable. There are places right now that are getting kind of close to it, like New Zealand looks a little bit like a utopia to me right now, but overall it's a fictional construct, and dystopias are very much surreal. We can see them all throughout the world. In the past, I've described Syria, Venezuela, North Korea as dystopias. Right now, we're all kind of in it. And so this is something that I like to use to sort of describe that dynamic between utopias and dystopias. We tend to think about dystopias as being all bad with having no element of good, and we tend to think of utopias as being perfect with having absolutely no seedy underbelly or no darkness to them, when really the Chinese symbol of yin and yang sort of describes it a little bit better. Even the brightest of future has a darkness to it, and even the darkest of futures has some element of hope or some element of good for somebody. It's not, again, evenly distributed, but there are people that benefit within the context of dystopias, unfortunately. And so the way ultimately that I like to describe the dynamics between utopias and dystopias is that it's not a binary. It's not either or. Both are simultaneous. Both are the opposite ends really of a spectrum. And so what we tend to do is find ourselves somewhere along the spectrum. And right now you might notice like we're not in full dystopia mode. This could be much, much worse. Like we could be looking at much higher death rates. We could be looking at much more widespread devastation. Of course, the situation is going to be worse for certain contexts, certain people than others, but overall, as a globe, we're not fully in the complete and total dystopic mode. And I think it's really important to address the dystopias and acknowledge them because you cannot acknowledge the extent to which you're experiencing a problem if you're unwilling to acknowledge how deep that problem runs. Wicked problems are such that they're highly complex, they're highly intricate, they have a tendency to wrap in much more issues than we think that they actually affect. And as a result of that, you know, if we aren't willing to look at the full depth of the problem, what we're going to end up doing is solving surface solutions and not the root problems themselves. And so there's a number of reasons why dystopias are particularly important to look at. And I think one of them is the fact that dystopias contain moral lessons. So dystopias tell us about how to engage with the world when the world falls apart, or how to challenge the world when there is abuse of power and you know, things going on that we really shouldn't be comfortable with. So one of the interesting pieces of research that I came across was from neuroscience, and it talked about how, you know, when we engage people in moral lessons, the parts of the brain that sort of light up are the parts that perceive an attack on identity. So when you engage in a political conversation with somebody, they're kind of experiencing it like an attack on themselves. Whereas if you take that moral lesson and you put it into the context of a story, that moral lesson is absorbed a little bit more easily. And we tend to lean into the story as opposed to, you know, putting up our walls and shutting it down. So dystopias are a really good way of depicting, you know, how it is that we take on challenging circumstances, how we should be behaving, what is moral, what isn't moral, and how to then address the problems when those problems arise. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that dystopias also give voice to marginalized people. It's not just a matter of looking at bright futures and saying that, you know, we're going to get there. We have to acknowledge, again, the depth of the true problem, who's suffering, who is being affected by the issues that we're facing, and how do we, you know, help everybody and ensure that the dystopia isn't affecting others in a way that, you know, we can't contribute and manage to their well-being. So I think this aspect of marginalized voices is really important. And I want to point out that there was a significant change that happened in science fiction a few years back. So if anyone's familiar with the Hugo Awards, the Hugo Awards are science fiction and fantasy's biggest awards, and they underwent this tumultuous period of having these very vitriolic, ignorant people hijack the community. And what happened was a lot of tension, a lot of you know, back and forth in terms of you know, disagreements and pushing back against the hatred that was emerging. And, you know, long story short, what emerged out of that was, you know, books and stories that were written by people of color, by women, by the LGBTQ community. So a whole new set of voices surfaced and came to the top when the problem was settled. And so now we're going to get a lot more stories from marginalized voices coming to the forefront. And I think it's important to pay attention to those because they talk about the dystopias and the systemic breakdowns that they've experienced. And dystopias reveal unintended consequences. So I like to remind people that a lot of visions of utopias and good futures start off well-meaning, well-intentioned, and often descend into dystopia. So a lot of dystopias are originally utopias that was somebody's idea of a good and perfect future. And so dystopias reveal how, you know, in the context of a system breaking down, what can go wrong, and the things that can emerge that we didn't expect and anticipate. So it's important to pay attention to those unintended consequences because unintended consequences are like the hallmark of wicked problems. And ultimately, dystopias are a call for action. So the intention of a dystopia is not to inundate and bombard you with these negative images. It's to really inspire you to act, to mitigate, to prevent, to build resilience against these futures that we don't want really for anybody. And I want to remind you that dystopias do exist. They're very much so real. There are plenty of people in this world that have profited from dystopias, that have a stake in the issue and keeping things exactly as they are to maintain the systems that don't work for everybody. And so it's our responsibility to pay attention to those dystopias and, you know, recognize them as they're emerging and be mobilized to do something about it. So what follows COVID-19? So I did a little bit of work through my company on what the post-COVID-19 scenarios, and in doing that, what I kind of realized is that we're in a cyberpunk scenario. So Bruce Sterling describes cyberpunk as low life and high tech. So we're all able to sort of connect with each other through, you know, Zoom and these technologies. We do have a fair bit of high tech, But life is kind of low right now. For a lot of people, and it's lower for some than others. But this is the most fundamental sort of definition of cyberpunk, and it's one that I like. And I particularly, I'm partial to working with foundational sort of descriptions and definitions, because once we get to the core of what the issue is, then we can understand what that means to go beyond it. And so the stories that I like to sort of point out to people right now in terms of what we're experiencing is the setup for what could be a cyberpunk future. So Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, I can see how a United States of the future could very much so reflect that. Blade Runner is another good example, and The Expanse, surprisingly, which is a space opera. But if you focus in on a look at the political and social dynamics, especially for the Belters, it's a really good example of how widespread devastation can spread. I think they actually start off the story with a virus, something that seems like a virus as well. So I think it's a good example to look to. What we're experiencing is kind of like a transition point to these stories. So it's not full cyberpunk yet, but we're setting up for this type of a future. So I do strategic foresight, and you've probably gotten a lot of explanations over the past few days about what strategic foresight is, and you may have some thoughts to add to that yourself. And so to me, it's the exploration of multiple alternative futures, the many ways in which the world can evolve. And once we understand how the world evolves, then we can consider the implications for us in those particular worlds. And what we're doing is that we're looking for ideas, innovation strategies that help us be resilient in the face of whatever future comes up. And so it's fundamentally different from forecasting. And in the context of COVID-19, I think it's really important to understand the role of both forecasting and foresight. So in forecasting, what we're doing is we're taking a bunch of data and input, and we're narrowing down, and we're making a prediction. Whereas in foresight, what we're doing is we're expanding out into the future, and we're looking at a spectrum of possibilities of what could potentially emerge, acknowledging the complexity that is there, recognizing that individual trends and things like that interact with each other in ways that we can't anticipate. And then once we have a sense of what could be the possibilities, then we work backwards to the present and understand what is going on. So forecasting is really important in the context of COVID-19, specifically because we want to look at the epidemic models, right? We want to understand what the scientists and what the researchers are saying and what they're forecasting based on the way that we're acting and the strategies that we're implementing right now. Just keep in mind that those forecasts are going to continuously be adjusted because they're based on the data that's being inputted and how we're changing ourselves in the process of responding to the crisis. Whereas foresight, we can sort of look at the complex situations that are emerging, the spectrum of possibilities, and understand what that means for us. So, it's probably safe to say at this point that even once the crisis settles, that we're headed for a mental health epidemic. Foresight is the sort of space where we can explore what does that mean? What sort of futures are we looking at? And what are the consequences and implications there? So what I did is that I took a few different methods and I stacked them against each other. The panarchy, or sometimes known as the adaptive cycle or the eco cycle, was one of them, and I used that from a systems lens. I think what we're experiencing right now as a result of the crisis is a release period. So we had a stable period before where things were status quo. COVID-19 came in, it disrupted everything, it forced us into a release where everything sort of changes rapidly. And as a result of that, eventually we'll end up in a reorganization period where things will come together in a different way. That doesn't mean they're going to come together better. It's entirely possible that the dystopia will deepen, but it will be, whatever comes next will be something new. And so when we combine that with Jim Dator's generic images, looking at the continuation scenarios, which are business as usual and growth, looking at collapse, which is a systemic breakdown, a further dystopia essentially, discipline, which is order and control, which is what a lot of us are experiencing right now with lockdowns, and transformation, which tends to be high tech, high spirit, and then how that sort of fits in with reorganization and release, and what follows afterwards. So what sort of themes of futures might emerge is kind of dependent partly on how long that release period is, and the release period is kind of dependent on the time to vaccine, essentially. And then I combined those two frameworks with the 7 foundations model, which is the model that I created. I want to emphasize that the reason why I'm using my model instead of using STEEP, which has similar categories, is that it's super, super important right now to acknowledge science, to acknowledge the data and the research, to understand what the scientific community is doing. Quite frankly, I think we should be doing that in all work. I also think it's important to acknowledge the artistic, the aesthetics of this, the stories that are emerging, the way people are responding emotionally to the insights that they're sharing through their personal stories. I think it's quite important. And the philosophical, which, you know, STEEP sometimes tacks on V, which is values. The philosophical is super, super important here because we're looking at human nature, we're looking at knowledge and truth, reality, perception. That expansion of the philosophical is really important to consider. So I'm going to urge you that, you know, as you go forward, you think about how the models and the frameworks you use get you the results and outcomes that you're looking for, because the frameworks that we use essentially help guide the outcomes that we reach. And so if we're looking at comprehensive problems, what we need to do is not just, you know, tie ourselves to one particular framework. It helps to have a stacked set of methodology that you can engage with to add variety and to add complexity to the problem that you're looking at, because oftentimes our models and our frameworks are quite deductive. So they're trying to reduce complexity of the problem so that we can make sense out of them. But reducing complexity from a problem means that sometimes you can remove the very thing that makes it complex to begin with. So stacking methods can sometimes help with that. And so once I did all this work and stacked the methods, what I came up with was a modular set of scenarios that includes some, you know, elements of what a collapse could look like and what a further dystopia could look like, but also includes, again, the Jim Dator's generic images categories, the continuation, the discipline scenario, and the transformation scenario. And every single line that you see here within every single box is a different scenario that you could play with. And what I tend to do is that I, you know, take one scenario, you can extrapolate it out with something like a futures wheel and to fully flesh it out. So for instance, if I were to look at continuation and the philosophical, the first line there is commoditized panic. So what does it mean to live in a world where commoditized panic is the norm? The other thing that I do is that I take different pieces off of, you know, either out of a different futures or within a different column, and then play around and look at what happens when two things meet and the combination of those two things as well. So this is currently available right now on my website at multiversedesign.com, and you can go and download it there, and please feel free to use it. What I do want to emphasize is this is not all the work by any means. There is a lot of work that needs to be done before this and after this in order to really make the most of what we're seeing and to address the problems that we're experiencing adequately. And so the other thing that I want to mention while we're here and we're talking about dystopias, this cartoon was sort of going around on social media, and I want to emphasize that I do think there is a relationship here between what we're seeing with COVID-19 and climate change. So COVID-19 itself is a reflection of environmental unsustainability and our relationship with the environment and how we treat the environment. This came out of wet markets, so we should be very mindful of that. And you know, environmentally, we're seeing a little bit of a break for the planet. We're seeing a decrease in air pollution. But remember, this is a complex problem, so we're also seeing an uptick in things like medical waste. So there was a story out of Hong Kong that described how you know, the beaches, the parks, and the streets are littered with masks and gloves and that sort of thing. So climate change has not gone away. I do think it is the dystopia that is still on the horizon, and potentially one that is far more detrimental than the one that we're experiencing. So, you know, where we don't want to end up is in the full end of that dystopic spectrum, where if we don't do enough, we're facing far greater consequences as a world. And so COVID-19 is kind of like an opportunity, not the best way possible to have learned this lesson, but it is an opportunity to understand how we respond to climate change and to these emerging complex issues in the future as well. And I think ultimately what we need is not the binary discussion around, the dark futures and the bright and happy futures. We need full spectrum futures. We need the nuanced images of what emerges. Again, even in the most transformative of scenarios, we're not going to see that transformation happen for everyone equally. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. The story that I like to point everyone towards, when they begin to talk about transformation, how this is the moment for the bright, happy futures is Ursula K. Le Guin's They Walk Away from the Amelas, or The Ones Who Walk Away from Amelas. And that particular story, highlights how you can have a utopia and the ugliness and the suffering that it takes to potentially get there. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to field any questions. If you want to reach out to me and you have further questions, you can reach me at the contact that's provided on this screen. And that's it. So thank you very much. And I see some questions coming in. Okay. So we have the problem with utopias is that we have to activate them without the dystopia being the sort of trigger for that activation. For example, online education some years ago for a utopia, but now the standard is during a dystopia. I kind of agree with that. Yes, of course, utopias should be triggered long before the dystopias are. And really the utopias should be used to mitigate and prevent the dystopias from emerging. Unfortunately, we tend to not react until there is a problem, and it goes back to that understanding of human nature. So we struggle a lot with a thing called a counterfactual, the what if, the alternative, and it's really hard for us to sort of grasp how an issue might affect us until we're in the midst of it. The what if questions we can sort of engage with, but until we're faced with the reality, it's hard to sort of process it and react to it. And I think that's one of the reasons why looking to storytelling and looking to things like speculative futures and experiential futures is really important. Yes, it is difficult to look at that table, but it is available for download and you can zoom in. So it was just on the screen. It was not meant to be read, unfortunately. To benefit from dystopias, we would need a paradigm shift to address our social, yes. In your opinion, what are some of the present day factors that are stuck, broken, or needing change? So I do think that part of the issue is that we have a crisis of power. I know that some others have described it as a crisis of imagination. I'm not sure I agree with that because I think there's a lot of smart people in the world who have a lot of smart ideas and are, presenting things that could really transform the world and really change the world. But there are far too many people, again, who have a vested interest in keeping the system exactly as it is because they benefit from the system being what it is. So if we look at, for instance, the $1 trillion bailout for corporations in the US, that's an attempt to keep the system exactly how it is. That's not an attempt to reorganize the system in a way that benefits people. It's an attempt to artificially maintain the system so that it benefits a few who are already in charge, who are already benefiting. And it's unfortunate that that is the case, but that is kind of how we respond within situations sometimes. And I think it's important to emphasize that, whatever system was in place before, what this is doing right now is sort of exasperating that system and drawing those problems out onto the surface. So it's not that the United States is suddenly experiencing a dystopia. It was already there. It was already showing signs of it beforehand. And now we have an issue that is just, ripping through the system in a way that really challenges it and strains it at every level. Okay, so as we are entering the scenario of cyberpunk, how to decide and act on corporate, organizational, or individual level, how to synchronize decisions and actions on a collective and collaborative scale. I think that's a really good question. I think there's a number of organizations and a number of community-led initiatives that are emerging that we should probably champion and support. I think this is also the time for online activism and engaging policymakers as much as we can, reaching out to them and making it known, what it is that we stand for and what it is that we're looking to see. This is a fluctuating situation, and so trying to react to it is quite difficult because the situation can sort of change under you as that's happening. On an individual level, though, take a notice of how people are acting, how organizations are acting, who is looking out for people, who is gouging and being predatory. Your economic dollar does matter. It's a vote within the system. And so what we pay for, we kind of get more of, essentially, right? That's kind of at a very basic level how the market works. So for instance, I look at Amazon. Amazon, it seems like a very evil corporation to me at this point, and Jeff Bezos's overall behavior, his attitude towards his workers, the fact that he's continued to make money during this time is a little bit disturbing. So, personally, I'm not going to be supporting them going forward. As much as I can, I'm going to try and buy locally and from alternative sources. So you can make, smaller decisions like that. And if we all make decisions like that, those decisions add up and have a collective impact. Okay, just scrolling down. So what does it mean to be in a cyberpunk? And let me just, sorry, it's like shifting on me as I'm reading the questions. I'm just going to scroll down again. What does it mean to be in a cyberpunk, and what are the implications? How do we address that in our strategy? Okay, so what you see in a cyberpunk are things like mega corporations that have disproportionate level of power, oftentimes way more than governments. So you can see how that's already starting to sound like the US a little bit. You have widespread inequality with very sometimes wealthy elites that have sort of separated themselves out, and a large number of people who are marginalized and disenfranchised. You do see pervasive technology. Technology oftentimes is, invasive. It is used for surveillance. It is used as a control mechanism. So cyberpunk can often not only just be a dystopia, it's like a very disciplined scenario as well. So in terms of that, the sort of reacting to it, it's understanding how those problems are emerging, and it's understanding how your actions contribute to those problems. And again, as much as you can, taking a stance against those issues, making sure you're not contributing to them, being aware of these issues as they arise. So if there's policy being passed that looks a lot like surveillance state, question it, challenge it. And then, one of the biggest things that we have at our disposal, if you're in a democracy, is voting, and making sure that we're voting for people who take care of our needs instead of gouging us further. Okay, how do you make a dystopic scenario realistic to decision makers? That's a good question. I think that's shifted now as a result of being in the scenario that we are in right now. You kind of just have to point to this, and challenge people. Did you pay attention to this? Were you prepared for this? Did you have strategy to address this? And what difference would it have made to your organization had you accounted for a dystopic scenario? I'm of the opinion that sometimes it's good to work with the far out speculative stuff and make the connections with seemingly, exaggerated far out scenarios. So I have previously run a session on Avengers Endgame, and looking at what it means for 50% of the world's population to disappear. That moment when Thanos has a snap and 50% are gone. And in that discussion that took place at UNESCO, the participants came to this conclusion that we've seen that before. We've seen that scenario before, and we've seen it in the form of pandemics and plagues, when a large number of the population is affected and the world kind of comes to a halt. And so as a result of that, we're able to then have a discussion that shifted around, like, what does it mean to be in a world that's experiencing a pandemic? So even if a scenario doesn't seem realistic, you can ask, like, how realistic was this scenario to, organizations and companies a year ago? So what is the best practices to generate discussion about dystopia frameworks in teams at work, and how do you approach it? So I think I might have just answered that a little bit, but I think really what you want to be doing is not just addressing the dystopia, you want to address a full spectrum of futures, and dystopias being one, because even dystopias, there's a variety of dystopias that you can experience. A pandemic is just one form of that. And so by encouraging, really strong systems-based foresight work that thinks about the future as a complex prototype, that we can sort of explore within, and then understanding what those multiple potential outcomes could be, I think is important to understanding how to design strategy at a later date. I would always say engage an expert as well if you can. Foresight experts tend to also be process experts. So they work across multiple industries and fields, and then because of that, they're able to cross-pollinate knowledge and information. If a utopia becomes a dystopia, can a dystopia become a utopia? Yes, and I've heard Jim Dator talk about how a collapse can potentially lead to a reorganization and a transformation scenario afterwards. So the idea of, or the construct of a dystopia is such that it can wipe everything out and create a slate to build something new upon. And so I think the real issue with utopias and dystopias is essentially recognizing who the utopia is for and who designed it, and who the dystopia is affecting and who's responsible for that as well. And so understanding the stakeholders behind it, I think, will give you a better sense. Community knowledge. Okay, so the last presenter talked about community knowledge in terms of prediction, and that it's not about our personal knowledge, which is too limited. Instead, it is important to tap into the breadth and depth of the knowledge that is held in the community. How do you see harnessing the community knowledge into understanding dystopian moral messages? I think that's great. So community knowledge, yes. Community knowledge is, really widespread, can run really deep. The people that are being affected by the issues that they're experiencing are the people that know it best, not the people who are coming in from the outside and observing. So I tend to work with people, if I'm working on a community project, I treat those individuals as the content expert, whereas I'm the process expert. So I have a set of tools and frameworks that I can use to then apply to their content knowledge and help surface content knowledge, and work with them in a way that allows them to speak to what they know best, and allows me to create that sort of scaffolding and construct around them that allows them to do that. So one idea / solution would be positive for some but negative for others in your model. Do you have different aspects, and how would you address the different perspectives and point of view? That's a really good question. So yes, I do think a solution that we think is good and could be good for many people can go astray and sometimes have negative outcomes. There's been examples, for instance, like of having new species introduced into an ecosystem, and then there's been quite a few of these examples, unfortunately, of that species running rampant. And the intention behind that, is always good and always attempting to address a problem, and then you see the consequences and the fallout of it later. So the way I sort of address that is, once I build a spectrum of scenarios, I take into account the viewpoints of a spectrum of stakeholders as well, and then understand how different scenarios could potentially play out. I think there's a lot of really good constructs around systems thinking that help with that. So for instance, systems archetypes are a really good framework for fleshing out problems. I'm introducing a set of anti-archetypes soon as well. I'm hoping that paper will be published sometime this year. I'll keep you posted on it. But it's effectively to look at, what are the negative patterns that can play out in a problem? So the negative consequences that can emerge, that's the archetypes. And then the anti-archetypes will look at how taking positive actions could also further fuel positive unintended outcomes as well. And sorry, I'm just scrolling down. Talk about the breaking the binary in Polytopias. Okay, you've caught on to some of my work. So the concept of Polytopias is, something that I came up with in looking at the binary conversation between dystopias and utopias that we tend to get caught up in. And so Polytopias are stories of change that include many places and many people. So an example of a Polytopia would be Animal Farm from George Orwell, where we can see that sort of descent from an idyllic utopic place and the slow and gradual breakdown towards a dystopia. Another good example is a TV show called Years and Years, which looks at a particular family and how they're impacted by the broader political issues that are playing out in the UK over a period of 5 years. And we see, portions of their lives in details, and then we see them speeding through certain bigger issues and then understanding what the implications are on them. So I think that's a particularly good example. What I would really like to see is the opposite. I would really like to see stories of change that show us what happens when the dystopia ends. What do you do afterwards? So an example of that could be for children or for young adults. The Hunger Games is a prominent dystopia. And so what happens in the aftermath of that? How do they recover? How do they build anew? I think we see a lot of stories of destruction and not enough of rebuilding. And let's see, would you say that dystopic shocks can be helpful to awake society from sliding entropy? Potentially, yeah. I think we're gonna find out. This is a pretty dystopic shock for a lot of people, and I think a lot of people wouldn't have seen this coming in terms of, you know, that the world could change so quickly, so fast. And so we can probably anticipate that there's going to be some shifts in values, that you know, some people are going to be activated and you know, really push towards making transformative change. I think there is a case being made right now, a really strong case to galvanize communities around climate change, and understanding what the implications of what we're experiencing are for the sort of bigger emerging issue on the horizon. And I think that's, it could lead to some positive changes there. And so, yes, there is opportunity, but I would be cautious about that. You know, after the Spanish flu, there was a lot of sort of denial and forgetting of the issue because they wanted to focus on the war that was happening at the same time. And so, you know, the Spanish flu is called the Spanish flu, not because it originated from Spain, but because the Spanish government was openly talking about it and addressing the issue, whereas other countries sort of suppressed it because they were engaging in a war. So how we sort of react afterwards and whether or not we're willing to engage in transformative change, I think I'm cautiously optimistic about that. I also kind of want to acknowledge that, you know, if for some reason somebody came to us tomorrow and said, hey, this could be over, we can go back to normal, you can have your normal lives back exactly as it was, a lot of us would want to say yes to that. That would be very tempting to say yes to. And so whether or not we produce anything transformative out of this, I would hope so, but I'm not fully making that bet. Let's say that. Yeah, so the problem with utopias is that we don't put attention in putting them into action, and we just formulate them as they become useful in hard times. So they are not utopias being taken to the real world, but another idea put into action during hard times as such as 3D printed mass. What do you think about the inability of humans to activate during utopias during normal times? Yeah, it's really challenging. I think we love convenience. And I think we love convenience almost more than we love anything. So change is hard. Change is hard for people, even change that is leaning positive, because sometimes change requires, one, a considerable effort on your part, but sacrifice. You have to give up things sometimes to make change happen. And so if that's the case, you know, how much of our lifestyles are we willing to give up? How much of our, you know, knickknacks and things and products and stuff are we willing to give up? I go back to the Amazon example just because there's so many people who are still ordering from Amazon right now. You know, think about your actions in that scenario. So unless you're ordering something that's absolutely essential that you need, you know, that's understandable. And that's a resource, you know, that people can use and that is convenient for us. But, you know, how many people are buying things to decorate their homes right now? So if we're all individually participating in these constructs that we're railing against at other times, we're just supporting the system that was, and we're supporting the, you know, the constructs that are. So I think it's hard for people to change. It becomes much easier to change when you're in the midst of the catastrophe and you have no choice and you're being impacted by it. When you're not being impacted by it, it's really hard to engage. And I think that's something that we have to work upon. And it's one of the opportunities that has come out of this, is to educate people further on, yeah, there's real consequences to our actions, and there are going to be continued consequences to our actions if we don't make significant change now. And that change does require sacrifice. Okay, I think I might have gotten, do you think visual arts will need to become immersive and or strictly virtual to play a role in creating dystopias that will be paid attention to? I think it's going to be one element. And I think certainly, depending on how long this goes on for, virtual worlds are going to become more important because we need some form of escape and we need somewhere to go when we're all stuck inside. So there is a potential boom that could come out of that for VR. But I don't think it's the only thing that can come about. And I think back to an example that was done by Superflux, the Air from the Future, where they set up a device that, you had to sort of breathe in the toxic air from 2030 based on, the scientific data of where pollution was headed at the time. So having to breathe in toxic air is a way of sort of shocking people into thinking, like, is this the air I want to breathe all the time? Is this the air I want my children to breathe? So I think virtual worlds are probably one particular way of going about it. I do think art has an important role to play in what's coming and shaping our thinking and shaping how we take action. So one of the things I didn't mention earlier during the presentation is that I don't think it's a coincidence that the children who grew up with stories like Harry Potter and the Hunger Games as core narratives are now have grown up and are the same people that are railing against gun violence and are calling for gun control and are fighting for climate change. I think, so there is research that demonstrates that the more closely we identify with a character of a story, the more likely we are to adopt their values and their behaviors. And so dystopias, when they're for younger children, for instance, are set up to be calls for action. They're stories about how do you challenge the status quo, how do you challenge power, how do you take down abusive power. And so when those core narratives are instilled at such a young age, they become a part of you and a part of who you are and how you see the world and your perspective in it. And I think that's why it's super important to pay attention when we're doing foresight work to what is happening in art, because art is sometimes the counterculture, but it deeply influences the culture that exists and the value systems we then end up creating for ourselves. So capitalism is ready and willing to rush us out of this great pause and back into consuming our way to normal. Especially in the US, many are so uncomfortable being the ones who want to stop the doing. So yet the pause is so valuable. How do we resist in theory and praxis? It's quite challenging. Because some of it is out of your control, right? Like we have to acknowledge that as much individual action as we take, the system that's in place is going to do everything it can to maintain itself. And so in the US, I shudder to think about whether or not there's going to be change, because there's far too many people that are still supporting Trump's policies. And he still has, I don't know how, but a surprisingly high, favorable rating where people think he's doing a good job. I think it has to be a local based approach in a context like that, where it's state by state. And I actually saw a signal come out of California where they're declaring themselves a nation state in order to separate themselves from the policies of the federal government. And so you're going to see a fair bit of backlash. And I hesitate to say this, the fight is going to be bigger there. And it's going to be bigger because the system is going to do everything to maintain itself. The current government is going to do everything it can to maintain itself as well. So you've got some tough decisions ahead of you, and policy is power. Policy makes a very big difference. I would strongly urge anyone who is thinking of abstaining from voting because Biden is a candidate not to fall into that trap. That almost ensures 4 more years of Trump, and I don't think anybody wants that, but I think it's those individual things. So treat your votes like they're precious, because they are, and treat your money like it's an economic vote, because it is. And where you put your dollars into is going to effectively determine what you get more of to some extent. Okay, love what you said about needing more stories about rebuilding following a dystopia. As someone who works in TV development, curious about why there hasn't been an appetite for more of these stories and how can we encourage the shift in the marketplace. Okay. So I like to describe Canadian television as being highly utopic sometimes. So if you've heard of the show Schitt's Creek, which just wrapped up, it was a Canadian show that gained popularity quite widely. And it's a modern day utopia. It's got a lot of the same hallmarks of it's an isolated sort of little place, a small town where everybody gets along, quite green. The conflict in utopias tends to be not these sort of big systemic, issues, or not like violence, not war. They tend to be individual misunderstandings. And Schitt's Creek is a particularly good example of demonstrating conflict in the most positive way imaginable. So part of the reason why I think utopias have sort of not done so well in the mainstream is, one, because we like stories about conflict. Stories about conflict are high tension and they make for good stories. But we've gotten into a place, especially with Hollywood, of there being these big budget films and then these indie stories. And I think where the utopia could potentially live is on TV screens and in that sort of middle disappearing space in between the indie films and the big blockbusters, which have more or less kind of just gone out the window, unfortunately. So utopias might lend themselves really well to shorter stories, partly because they don't have that sustained conflict. But I think there is potential, especially if we're going to be shifting towards indie creators, to create more of those. It's a question of, partly like whether or not we see negative stories, more dystopias come out after this, or we see some positive stories come out of this. It's going to depend partly on how long this goes on for and how destructive it is. And so it's possible sometimes to see more transformation when the period of destruction is longer. But it's also possible that because we've experienced a dystopia for longer, that it becomes ingrained as well. So it's challenging. I think people need to actively take that on and make it something that they invest in and want to do. And if you're in a position where you can champion those stories, ask for those stories, then do so, please. One of the topics mentioned, sorry, am I skipping a question? No. One of the topics mentioned related to the current situation has been a lack of assertive leadership. What are your thoughts on the leadership we need post-COVID-19? And if we go democratic, the risk of not reaching consensus, or do we allow strong people to take power positions and risk them driving agendas and becoming winner in the dystopic future? On both counts. So yeah, we do need strong assertive leadership, but we need genuine leadership that speaks plainly, that is willing to talk to us like we're adults as well. I look at the leaders that are doing quite well. Jacinda Ardern is, a shining example of how to handle a conflict right now, and has been for quite a while. And somebody did point out to me that it's interesting how the countries that are faring well and have been more resilient to this are also countries that have been led by women. So I do think gender plays a role here in terms of having gender equality and how that shapes society. I also think leaders that have set aside political agendas are doing better. So, Canadian leadership hasn't done so badly, has done quite well, given all things. They could have responded earlier, they could have done better, but in some ways they are handling themselves well. And it does require one, stepping up to the plate and being honest with your constituents, but also setting aside politics and not making this about power grabs and not making this about other issues, and finding ways to work together. And our parliament has done a good job at that. And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case everywhere. So I think it goes back to elections. Who we vote for does matter. There's probably a significant amount of electoral reform that is required. And we have to also keep in mind that yes, democracy is flawed. It is not the best system. It's not the most ideal system, but it is the best system that we have. And so we have to find a way to work with it until we can come up with something that is better. Okay, how are you thinking about Indigenous community grown futures? How can we distribute these tools of foresight to people on the margins? Yeah, I think there's probably a number of ways that can do that, and some other people can potentially speak to it better than I can. The way that I've sort of gravitated towards is using mass media and storytelling. So I use stories that already exist as a way to talk about the future. So one of the reasons why I use stories like Avengers Endgame, even though they seem far-fetched and a little bit fantastical, is because so many people have watched it and so many people are familiar with it. And when you're familiar with a certain image, you can sort of, suspend disbelief in terms of, what is and what isn't, especially if the scenario is out there, and engage with it in a way that maybe you wouldn't have when you can sort of feel like it's going to happen to you, or if you aren't familiar with it and it's too foreign. So art is certainly a way to do that, and I think it could potentially play a bigger role going forward. If democracy is not the best system, what is? That's a very good question. I don't have an answer to that right now. I think that is something that we need to collectively design. I think it's something that requires a greater level of imagination around. It's possible that technologies like blockchain can facilitate distributed decision making. I would also like to see alternative forms of what we have right now in terms of voting for a person. We vote for a person and we vote for a party and we vote for agendas. And the problem with that is that when we're thinking about long-term issues, voting in a party or voting in a particular person is based on election cycles. And so election cycles that, change every 4 years are not always congruent to the problems that we need to address that can go on for 10, 20, 30, like really long-term futures. And so that system is kind of flawed around, having party agendas. And I think a potential alternative to that is value-based voting or issue-based voting, where we're not necessarily voting for a personality. We are voting for how we want to distribute budgets. We're voting for what issues society prioritizes, which can, of course, have its flaws as well. But if we're willing to prototype these alternatives, then at least we can explore what the consequences of those are and how that could go right, but also how that could go wrong.